Hello everyone. In the first part of my video lecture on homeostatic functions, we have seen what is homeostasis, how what are the steps that are involved in homeostasis, and feedback system, different types, two different types of feedback system, positive and negative feedback system. We have seen in the part 1 video lecture of the homeostatic functions. In the part 2 video lecture of the homeostatic functions, we shall see the examples for these feedback mechanisms. Okay, so remember this, there is a first step, change in the equilibrium state. Sensors are there. Through the afferent pathway, they send the information to control center and processing occurs here. And the response is brought back to the effectors through the efferent pathway, and effectors perform all the functions required to bring the change in the variable to the normal, thus maintaining the equilibrium. Okay. Now, in the positive feedback system, as I have explained in the last lecture, I was telling to you the end sequence of events, the end event will bring about the reinforcement of the precedent event, first event again, to bring back the same response. Now, one of the examples that we have considered was the feedback system, positive feedback of oxytocin secretion. Now, oxytocin is an hormone that is secreted by the pituitary gland. In fact, it is produced by the hypothalamus and stored and secreted by the pituitary gland. The oxytocin secretion is controlled through what is known as the positive feedback mechanism. Oxytocin has two important functions in the body. Number one, it causes labor during the childbirth and the milk ejection during the child suckling the milk. Now, whenever the gestation period completes, the baby is getting ready to get delivered, there is uterine contractions that occur in the uterine smooth muscles. These contractions stimulate the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland to release the oxytocin. Now, the oxytocin release acts on the uterine muscles again and bringing about more and more contractions. These more and more contractions further stimulate the hypothalamus and the pituitary to release more and more oxytocin. Here you can see the end result is contraction of the uterine muscle. This is consistently stimulating the initial hypothalamus and the pituitary to release the oxytocin. Release of the oxytocin is amplified consistently to bring about the childbirth. It stops only through the childbirth. Now, the second one is the milk ejection reflex. When the baby is suckling the milk, the suckling acts as a stimulus, and due to that, there is continuous ejection of the milk from the mammary gland. Now, both of them are self-limiting. That means the end response, either a childbirth or ejection of the milk, will stop only by the stoppage of the stimulus that is started. Okay. Now let us see, in this flowchart you can see as the uterine contraction starts when the babies head into the cervix, there are stretch receptors that are present in the cervix which pass the neuronal impulse to the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. Now the posterior pituitary releases oxytocin, and oxytocin comes and acts on the uterine muscles, bringing about further and further contractions. Now contractions occurred here. This event further stimulating the stretch receptors to supply the neuronal impulse to hypothalamus and pituitary, and there is a release of the oxytocin. This is called reinforcement of the same sequence of event, bringing about amplification in the feedback end result. Okay, and this stops only when there is child delivery. The uterine contractions stop, and as a result oxytocin production also stops. So it is one of the examples for positive feedback mechanism. Now consider this. Now, another function of the oxytocin, as I told you, is the milk ejection from the mammary gland. The stimulus for this is the suckling by the baby. It is a sensory input, goes to the hypothalamus, results in production of the prolactin, which produces the milk, and release of the oxytocin by the pituitary gland results in milk ejection from the mammary gland. Now you can see in this flowchart both the ways the functioning of the oxytocin. One is the suckling of the babies acting as a stimulus producing more and more oxytocin, and here the uterine contractions stimulating the production of oxytocin, bringing about more and more contractions. Now let us see the negative feedback mechanism. So in the previous lecture, I have explained to you what is negative feedback mechanism, steps involved, and the examples I told you, 3 examples: thyroid, parathyroid, and the adrenal secretions. First, let us see the negative feedback mechanism in the thyroid secretions. Students, as you all know, the thyroid secretions are under the control of pituitary and the hypothalamus. First, whenever there is low thyroid hormone in the blood, there is slowdown in the metabolic rate of the body. This slow metabolic rate stimulates the hypothalamus to release what is known as TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. It in turn acts on the anterior pituitary, releasing thyroid stimulating hormone. It acts on the thyroid gland, resulting in production of thyroid hormone. The thyroid hormones are T3, T4, and calcitonin, and the regulation of them is through negative feedback. Now, increased blood concentration. Now, the result is production of the hormone. Now, the increased blood concentration of thyroid hormone bring about inhibition. This is the negative feedback system. The end result, end product itself is inhibiting the production of the stimulant hormones. Okay, the thyroid hormones inhibit TSH and TRH, leading to shutdown of the thyroid epithelial cells. Okay, now the blood level of thyroid hormone decayed, the negative feedback fades away, and the system wakes up again. Okay, so this process started with the slow metabolic rate, stimulated the thyroid and stimulated the pituitary hypothalamus, released TSH released the thyroid hormone. Whatever the metabolic rate slowed down, it was brought back to the normal, and the negative feedback functioned. Now, in this picture, you can see the pituitary gland. This is the hypothalamus pituitary releasing the TSH, acting on the thyroid gland, and thyroid secretions in the blood, bringing back the metabolic rate to normal and inhibiting the pituitary and the thyroid. Now, consider this flow chart where it is clearly indicated whenever the slow metabolic rate in the blood, hypothalamus is stimulated and it releases TRH, and it stimulates the pituitary to produce TSH, and TSH stimulate the thyroid follicles to release T3 and T4, and T3, T4 raise the metabolic activity in the body. This raise in the thyroid secretions will bring about inhibition of the pituitary secretions, that is TSH, and inhibition of the hypothalamic secretion, that is the TRH. Both these function through what is known as the negative feedback mechanism. And in turn, whenever there is lowering of T3 and T4 or low metabolic rate, that stimulates the hypothalamus to produce. Okay, so this is a very good example of negative feedback mechanism. So consider this. Now, let us see the negative feedback mechanism in the parathyroid secretions. Now, as we all know very well from the endocrinology part of it, the parathyroid secretions are nothing but the PTH, that is the parathyroid hormone. It mainly functions to maintain the blood calcium concentration. And these secretions are also controlled through what is known as negative feedback mechanism. Now, on the parathyroid cells, there are what are known as the calcium sensory receptors. Whenever there is blood calcium level fluctuation, or whenever there is reduction in the blood calcium level, the calcium sensory receptors sense it, and there is secretion of the parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone that is secreted will perform all the functions to bring the calcium level to the normal. It may be through the leaching out of calcium and phosphate from the bones, or it may be through the reabsorption of calcium in the kidney and the gastrointestinal tract. Okay, so any of these functions are simultaneously working to bring back the calcium level to the normal. Now, once the calcium levels in the blood keeps increasing, now the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland, sense the increase in the blood calcium level and secrete what is known as calcitonin. Remember, calcitonin functions in antagonistic way to the parathyroid hormone to reduce the blood calcium level. Now, in this flow chart, you can see the thyroid hormone when there is low calcium level, um, when there is high calcium level produces calcitonin, and calcitonin functions to bring back the blood calcium level to the normal. And whenever there is low concentration of calcium in the blood, the parathyroid gland produces parathyroid hormone, which tries to bring back the calcium level to the normal. So the PTH is increasing the blood calcium level and calcitonin is decreasing the blood calcium level. Both of them function in opposite to each other. Okay, now in this flow chart also you can see the functioning of the parathyroid gland by leaching of the bones, producing calcium and phosphate, and reabsorption of calcium in the kidney and the small intestine, increasing the blood calcium level. So in this flow chart, you can see the PTH is increasing the blood calcium level and calcitonin is decreasing the blood calcium level. Both of them work in tandem to each other to maintain the blood calcium level. Now let us see the next example, that is a negative feedback mechanism in the adrenal secretions. Remember, adrenal gland, suprarenal gland, it produces glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids. Now the adrenal secretions are also controlled through what is known as negative feedback mechanism. Okay, so first let us consider the glucocorticoids. This picture you can see brain, the hypothalamus pituitary, which hypothalamus release the CRF and pituitary releases the ACTH, which acts on the suprarenal gland, that is adrenal cortex of the adrenal gland. Okay, now the glucocorticoids are released in response to ACTH that is produced by the pituitary gland. Whenever there is requirement of the glucocorticoids in the body, maybe due to a stress situation or circadian rhythm situations that are arise, requirement of the glucocorticoids, for example, the cortisol requirement increases, the pituitary produces ACTH. For the production of the pituitary ACTH, there should be secretion of corticotropin releasing hormone by the hypothalamus. So whenever there is requirement of the glucocorticoids, hypothalamus releases CRH, and CRH acts on the anterior pituitary releasing ACTH. This in turn acts on the adrenal cortex releasing the glucocorticoids. This flowchart you can see. Now, whenever there is a stress situation, the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary through ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex. Adrenal cortex releases the glucocorticoid, that is the cortisol. The cortisol helps in managing the stress situation of the body through various metabolic activities and bringing back it to the normal condition. That in turn has a negative feedback to stop the hypothalamus from releasing CRF. Let us see this in the next chart. Now, whenever there is low blood cortisol level, it stimulates the hypothalamus to release CRH, ACTH, and releasing cortisol. And whenever there is high blood cortisol levels, it has a negative feedback on the hypothalamus, suppressing it from producing the CRH, which ceases the production of the cortisol. In this picture, you can clearly see the production of the cortisol. The glucocorticoids brought back the stretch situation to the normal. Once this is done, glucocorticoid level increased and the metabolic activities took place. Once it is done, this results in negative feedback or inhibition on the pituitary productions and the production of the hypothalamus. It inhibits the production of corticotropin releasing hormone and also inhibit the production of ACTH. Okay, so the end product is glucocorticoid, and once its levels raise, it has a negative feedback on the glands that it released. Okay, so copy this to the notes. And whenever there is a inhibition or the negative feedback loop that is occurring, it may be a short loop or it may be a long loop. If the production of the cortisol inhibits the pituitary secretions, or the pituitary secretions inhibit the hypothalamic secretions, that considered under short loop inhibition. And if the cortisol levels in the blood directly inhibit the hypothalamic secretions, that is considered as a long loop feedback inhibition. Now, another type of secretion that is occurring in the adrenal cortex is the production of the mineralocorticoid. It's the aldosterone. It helps in maintaining the blood volume, blood pressure, and blood sodium and potassium levels to the normal. Okay, so this also follows a negative feedback mechanism. Now, secretion of the aldosterone is under these conditions where there is increasing the potassium ion concentration in the blood, decreasing the sodium ion concentration, decreasing the blood volume or blood pressure or dehydration, or the renin angiotensin pathway that takes place in the kidneys. Under these conditions, aldosterone secretion occurs in the adrenal cortex, which in turn stimulated by ACTH and the hypothalamic CRH. Now, once aldosterone is secreted, there is reabsorption of the potassium ions by the cells, and excess of potassium ions are excreted by the kidney tubules, bringing back the potassium levels to the normal. Once the potassium levels become normal, the aldosterone secretion stops, and ultimately there is stoppage of production of CRH and the ACTH. You can see the um, high level of potassium ions stimulate the production of aldosterone by the adrenal cortex. This aldosterone increases the uptake of potassium by the cells, and there is excretion of potassium ions in the kidneys, thus reducing the potassium levels. And aldosterone also has other functions like reabsorption of sodium and water in the kidneys, that thus restoring blood volume and the blood pressure. Okay, so once this is done, once the normalcy of bringing back the blood volume or blood pressure to normal, or reducing the potassium ion level, once this is done, there is inhibition of the adrenal cortex from production of the aldosterone. As a result, the aldosterone production stops. Okay, so once the result process is done, the inhibition process functions. This is known as the negative feedback loop. So that is regarding the examples for positive and negative feedback. Watch both the videos together repeatedly and try to understand homeostatic functioning of the body. Thank you.